Welcome to the Valentine's Day celebratory episode of Drinking on the Edge. I'm its host, David Fuhrer, and joining me is my co-producer, Matty Rosenberg of Radio Free Rhinecliff. Today, from across the globe, we have a multi-winemaker wine cellar gathering from the U.S. left coast, from his family estate of Caraccioli Cellars. We have GM Scott Caraccioli. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. Happy to be here. All right.
Okay. And on the opposite side of the Atlantic from where I am here in the Hudson Valley, we have Chris Unger of Headingley Estate of England.
Hi there. How are you?
Very, very well. Thanks for joining us there. And in the lower hemisphere, crushing grapes this time of year, different seasons upside down, is Louisa Rose, who is the brand ambassador and then some of Hill Smith Family Estates. Did I get that right?
Thanks, David. How are you going?
Oh, very well. Thank you. Inasmuch as Valentine's Day is often associated quite clearly with the color pink, we're here focusing on pink sparkling wines. Being that I am rather inexpert on that subject, and the folks here today are going to be far more informed than myself, I'm going to let them run with a lot of this. Again, it's a free-for-all amongst y'all, but just to get the general public clued in what's going on, if you can jump in, a brief history in our conversation about how things are with this category, this subcategory in the world of sparkling wines, both with you in your native lands and in your native markets and of your individual brands.
I'll jump in. Why not? We're the kind of the new kid on the block, I guess, in one respect, being from England. I think if we look at the UK and what's happening with English and Welsh wine at the moment, everything's new. Everything's an experiment. Everything's kind of innovative. It's a big mixing pot of learning, knowledge gaining, and things like that. So we don't have predefined styles or a direction to take, which I think is part of the beautiful thing that we're working with. We're kind of the old world in the new world. So we've got a lot of flexibility in terms of how we make our wines. The biggest limiting factors we have is the instability of our climate. We are marginal and we have massive vintage variations in terms of what we can expect. So that adds a whole kind of load of complexity to how we how we grow our grapes, and then obviously subsequently how we make our wines. On the winemaking, it's generally we make traditional method, working with the classic international varieties that they use in the famous regions like Champagne. But we've also got some interesting varieties like Pinot Precoce, which is a synonym for called Frühburgunder, which is a German variety, and we're playing around a little bit with that. But there's a lot of moving to what we're doing. But the modern industry in England is only, we're only really 20, 30 years old. So it's a big innovation, a big mixing pot of ideas. To say there's sort of a standard approach would be way too early to say that, I think. I mean, that's England and rosé, sparkling rosé in a nutshell at the moment.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a bit about the upside down part of the world. So our focus with sparkling wine is very much with our Jants vineyards and our Jants estate, which is in Tasmania. So that little island down the bottom of Australia, surrounded by the Great Southern Ocean, which keeps it air conditioned, it keeps it cool in summer and stops it from completely freezing in winter. But it is proving to be a beautiful place to make sparkling wines. Jant started with the first grapes being planted in 1986. We might have a few years on the UK, but not a lot, but made very traditionally. And the classic champagne varieties of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay and Meunier grow beautifully in Tasmania. So they're very much our focus, as is the more traditional method of bottled fermentation. But the flavours are they're unique to Tasmania and our particular vineyards that we have down there. As far as how the wines grow, I love talking about Jants around the world because it's rosé particularly is appreciated probably more particularly in the US than it is in Australia. Australians tend to drink the whiter cuvées, the Chardonnay dominant cuvées, whereas the really pretty pink ones sell much better overseas, which is, I think it's fantastic because they've got so much beautiful sort of perfume and flavour, and I think they're so much more fun to look at and drink. So why wouldn't we always drink pink bubbles?
Yeah, Scott in California, very similar to the traditional method in terms of everything that we do. We try to push process as much as we can at Caraccioli. And I think as times went on, we were founded with Michelle Salg as our winemaker, who was at Roeder. So the way that we look at rosé is very, very precise, very much a red wine edition. And it went from being, oh, let's see how we can kind of make rosé in 2006, which was our start. So we're very young. A lot of the first vineyards in California that were used for sparkling were probably in the 70s overall, still pretty darn young for kind of like this wave of understanding. That said, there's a lot of movement in sparkling wine, and our rosé went from being percent of our sparkling production to becoming half of it. And it's one of those things where it's been probably like our most demanded wine from our consumers. And it's kind of to back what you were saying in terms of there is a market for good pink bubbly in California, the United States, and it's being in the kind of center of it all. It's great to be a part of it growing and kind of seeing it grow just within my own brand as well as the country in general.
Uh, Taking a cue from Louisa, something she mentioned, given its more noticeable and more appealing, striking appearance, so why is it that white or blanc sparkling wines chosen with greater frequency and made presumably with greater frequency around the world?
From a UK perspective, we're limited by just the grape resource. We have more Chardonnay. And I should caveat that in that at Hattingly Valley, we only use red fruit in our rosés, so we don't have any Chardonnay additions. So we use Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Pinot Precoce at a very small level. But we are limited with vineyard resource because a lot of our other brands or other wines have the addition of Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, and we sell more of our wide versions. And we are limited by just having red fruit resource. Now that may change as we get more vineyards planted, but really it's not very exciting, but it's production limitations that drive our stylistic directions at this stage. However, year on year, we are increasing our volume of rosé because of the demand that we're seeing. And I mean, that really echoed what Louisa said is exports, our biggest single markets, export markets for our rosé as well. So even in the UK, whilst it's a healthy market, we sell more rosé in Norway than we do in the UK. And that's a whole nother topic, talking about Norway and English wine. But from a UK perspective, or from a Hattingly perspective, it's just that the access that we have to red fruits. And so what proportionately, percentage-wise, we probably do around 20% of our total production would be rosé. And we only have one SKU or one brand that's a rosé.
Let's get back to the other two, and also by a greater extension, the heartland, shall we say, or the guiding light people look at for sparkling wine, Champagne, which has far more red grapes planted than the white of Chardonnay, and a couple oddballs they have there too. So why is it then, do you reckon, again, Louisa and Scott, you have the flexibility to source any number of red grapes and Champagne as well. Why isn't that we don't see more pink sparkling wines, do you reckon?
I think a lot of it's been about fashion. If you think about still rosé wine, so I'm going back a fair while now, but if you go back sort of 30 years, there wasn't a lot of rosés around.
Yeah.
But sorry, I just dropped out there for a minute. But I think people were looking for it. And now people think it's okay to drip pink. Even in Australia, and I know I said we don't have a huge market for it here, but compared to what it was, we drink a lot more both still and sparkling rosés now. But I think one of the things you ought to remember about sparkling wines is that many of them, and you're right about the percentages of grapes in Champagne, but you can make a beautiful white sparkling wine out of Pinot Noir as well. We still get that beautiful creaminess that Pinot Noir gives you, and that, the expression and those lovely sort of more developed flavors as well with some age. So it doesn't have to be pink to get the benefit of having the red grapes. It is a bit of a bonus, and sometimes it's literally that sort of stylistic decision that you make towards the end. Scott's already mentioned that. I think, Scott, without putting too many words in your mouth, that your wines become pink at that dosage at the end where you're adding a little bit of red wine back. And that's probably the case for a lot of sparkling wines. So you have that beautiful sort of flexibility as you're molding them over the years as to how pink you want it in the end.
Yeah. So we do it right at before tirage. So once the base wines are dry, then we'll basically do trials on still red wine barrels fermented at about 23 bricks and then figure out addition levels. And it's for us something where my base blend of rosé is still 60% Chardonnay. So it's 40% Pinot and then 1%, 2% still red wine added back. And the character of the wine changes dramatically because my brut is that same base composition. So it gives the profile the opportunity to go completely red fruit, especially in upon release. As it gets older, it goes more umami. But I think that there's something very attractive both about it in the glass, and then also it is very appealing with the extra fruit that is kind of on brand with still rosé becoming so popular over the last 8-10 years. And in that same vein, the rosés kind of went along with it from a sparkling perspective and a still perspective. And the still rosé is probably flattened or in decline in the US right now. But I think that sparkling wine, on the other hand, is probably trending up. It's kind of seeing a net positive effect just in terms of people's demand on sparkling rosé overall.
Yeah, I think there's some really good points there because I think also how we consume sparkling rosé, it's consumption moments. I think perhaps with other sparkling wines, we'd talk more about sort of gastronomy and enjoying kind of the bigger, richer, wide sparklings across meal. That I know the way that we see rosé, sparkling rosé consumed, it's generally the pure aperitif style. But Scott talking about umami and things like that. I know again at Hattingley, we have a proportion that's barrel fermented. So we are looking for some of those more kind of savory elements, not just that it be kind of red fruit dominant, kind of a pretty wine. We want something that has a bit of structure, something that can actually pair up with food. So it's not that kind of pure aperitif. And I think talking to Lou's sort of trends, I think it's very much been like that. Oh, it's the aperitif, it's the pink drink that you have before you move on to serious wine. So I think it's part of the evolution that I know that we're taking is we released a prestige cuvee to rosé last year. It's a one-off, but it's 100% barrel fermented, and we treat that wine. We don't serve it in flutes, and we treat it like almost like a Burgundy, a white Burgundy, because it's got a lot of white Burgundy elements, and we want it to warm up in glass. We want those umami, savory flavors coming out, but that's kind of on the edge, and our consumers aren't quite there yet. They're still learning the category. We want to take the wine that way, I think, as well.
I think that's a great point, Chris, because we do think about our bubbles as celebratory, but one of our focuses very much with Jantz is to remind people what a beautiful food wine, sparkling wines can be. And with rosé, a little bit more body usually. And you're right, if you've got fermentation, and for us, our Jantz vintage wines, 100% barrel fermentation, 100% wild ferment for its base wines, and it gives it a beautiful texture that makes it perfect. And Tasmania's surrounded by ocean. It's got some of the most beautiful sort of seafood, and pair it with scallops or with salmon, or it's just amazing.
Yeah, I don't think rosé is just for a amuse-bouche or flourless chocolate cake or some simple dessert where it always kind of wants to get typecasted. Throw it in the middle of a tasting menu and you'd be surprised at how well it goes with the variety of proteins, and it never really gets the shot.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know this year I enjoyed my King's Rosé with my Christmas lunch, which was very traditional. It was roast vegetables. I think we had pork and lamb and things like that. And it works because it's got a bit of tannin. It's got some of that sort of that power against it. I think it works. Yeah, you're right. It's kind of a wine that you can explore across a whole variety of different foods.
And Chris, your comment before about how it almost acting like a Burgundy. I mean, it's made from the same varieties, whether it's rosé or not, isn't it? And why wouldn't it then go with the foods that we use to match with Pinot Noir and Chardonnay?
Yeah, exactly.
As I begin tasting some of your wines that you so generously provided me, I'm going to chime in with my comment. My pink sparkling wine enlightenment moment was I think it was my first visit to Champagne, and it was 97, I believe it was, at Epernay's Les Grillades, famous restaurant still in place. I was sitting with Christian Paul Roger when he was still employed, working with his namesake company, family company, and we were sitting at Les Grillades having dinner. And It was, I believe, a few weeks earlier that his dear friend Gerard Jaboulet had passed away through a boating accident. And we were getting ready to order our mains, which were grilled lamb on the fire there. And we, of course, had a bottle of Hermitage of Jaboulet to commemorate the good man. And we were also drinking his rosé champagne, non-vintage at the moment. And I discovered through this sentimental moment, he was getting a bit teary-eyed. And it wasn't just that moment, but the interlacing of his sparkling rosé with the rare lamb going off the coals there worked in a way that I had never experienced, ever thought could be. And it was in striking contrast to the Hermitage of Jaboulet that we also had, which was a relatively recent vintage. And I thought, this is coming from very different angles, very different places, how wines can work with a very intensely umami, free protein meat like that lamb was. It was about the quality of good pink sparkling wines with meals that you wouldn't necessarily consider.
I think one of the things, David, that we forget about often with sparkling wines, and particularly vintage wines, although non-vintage wines can be as well, is they've actually got quite a lot of age on them, often when they're actually first released. More so, in fact, than many of the red wines these days, with the move to younger and younger vintages of red wines that we drink. And yet sparkling wines have, the often beautiful sort of age and complexity that comes through the work with base wines as they're still wines, whether they're in oak or whether they're in lees or tanks. And then they have that beautiful reductive aging in the bottle, which brings out a whole nother spectrum of fine complexity and different flavors. And that's where you get, I think, a lot of those umami characters sort of coming through. As Scott, I don't actually use that word, but I'm going to use it now, though. Thank you, Scott. And then, of course, once it's been cured and it's got more of that honeys and complexes coming through the bottle age. There's so much going on in something that often people might think is incorrectly, I think, but perhaps just a bit frivolous. It's no wonder that we can talk, and we could talk for hours about our great sort of food and wine matches, I think, with sparkling wines.
Yeah,
as well as our great experience, Matt.
From an English perspective, if we use the 2023 harvest as an example, you may have seen in the press that it was a very big harvest, and there was perhaps some wrong language used about it being a miracle. It was a miracle up until June, and then it rained for pretty much all of June, July, and August. So we had the kind of unusual perspective where we had really low sugars and really low acids. We had derogation to acidify our wines and capitalize our wines, which is kind of just classic English kind of weirdness. But to Lou's point is there wasn't a lot of flavor in the grapes because of the dilution, the sheer number of rainfall that we had. So a lot of our flavor is that magic that happens in the bottle after went from tirage on. I mean, we do have vintages where it's slightly more fruit forward vintage. 2022 was a good example of that, but 2023, we're going to really rely on what happens in the bottle, that magic that happens in the bottle to build in layers of complex flavor. It's going to be a fruit vintage, more of a secondary flavor vintage rather than a primary flavor vintage. And I think that's part of our evolution as an industry as well, that we just don't have stability. But I think we do rely more so on what happens in that bottle to give the wines that complexity and that richness and those kind of, again, we're going to use umami again, but I think umami is a secondary flavor compound. It's not a primary flavor compound, particularly for us. I know that's the case.
Give a shout out to Scott's addition to this as well. I recently opened a bottle of his 2017 Blanc de Blanc, though, with some friends who really marveled at its richness and complexity while still having the vivacity that a good sparkling wine should also have.
Thank you. We're in a pretty lucky spot from a climate perspective where we don't see a lot of variation. Everything that I do is vintage. And year after year, it's pretty close. I would say people that maybe don't have, if you didn't have two vintages of our wines, but you were familiar with them, you're probably going to pull it out of a lineup and know what it is. And it's part of what drew us to developing our project in Monterey County, Santa Lucia Highlands. And it's what kind of brought Michelle here too, was specifically the stability of the Pinot Noir, as well as that phenolic ripeness that we get at low sugar accumulation when we're pulling for sparkling wine. And the kind of the balance of the horsepower of the Pinot and the structure of the Chardonnay is always something that we're in balance of. And then when we have exceptional vintages, I can make things like Blanc de Blanc, but that happens maybe 2/3 of the time, something like that, where a Blanc de Blanc or a Blanc de Noir by itself to me is an exceptional enough experience. But I'm relatively small. Like we pulled 60 tons for sparkling this year or 70 tons for sparkling. So it's, I might not have, it might not be a Pinot Noir year. It might not be a Chardonnay year, or which makes our base blends being a composition of both a lot more stable. But then when we do have one of those varietals that definitely like showcase themselves, I get to produce a Blanc de Blanc or a Blanc de Noir in a small quantity. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it and it came through. I think the single varietal expression is often very difficult, or the most.
That said, I think Chris had said that the heading is 100% Pinot Noir. Is that correct?
No. So only red fruits. So we use Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier,
excuse me.
and Pinot Precoce. And that is, in England, one of the things we struggle with color. And I mean, it's trying to find a sustainable red fruit source. And that's why we use Precoce. So Precoce, Pinot Precoce, it's a mutation of Pinot Noir. It's a very early ripening red variety. It's actually the first grape that we have in the winery. So it ripens before Chardonnay. So it's a bit of a banker for us. And so that we can actually make some red wine, stick it to barrel so that we can color up our Meunier and Noir. Should it be like a harvest like last year, where we didn't see any fruit really above 18 Brits. And so we've got acids. In a cool year, we could have acids at sort of 14.5 totals, and our pH is down to 2.9. We've got some pretty extreme numbers. And I mean, having worked in Oz with Luce for a number of years, when I first started working for Hattingley, I almost fell out of my chair when I heard the numbers that we were working with. And you just go, you can't make wine from that. Nothing's gonna work. But there's a whole number of other variables that are gonna work with it. But we use red fruit primarily to try and get some color. And, we don't have super pink wines. And we work on a vintage model with our rosés as well. But it has been probably like the 19 vintage. We probably undercooked it a little bit with the color, and maintaining color so that it does look like a rosé, not like a Blanc de Noirs or something like that can be a challenge for us as well. And again, it's sort of just our production technique. It's finding the right time to add. We can't rely on skin color at press, so it's really red wine addition. So but it's finding the right time to add that, and where we can finesse it along the way. We're still kind of navigating that and working that way, because I mean we've only made wine since the first harvest was 2010, and in those last 13 years, every harvest has had its own sort of unique perspective. So there's still very much a steep learning curve to go there. But we do that pure red fruit model in terms of kind of those primaries. We get the primary flavors, those fruit flavors that we like from the red varieties. And that's really the direction we will continue to take as we see.
Yeah, looking at your wine here in the glass, by comparison to your other fellow guests, it does appear to be a little bit more pale, less pink appearing than the other two. To be fair, no slam to the smell and taste. It's all delicious. But yeah, it's clearly it doesn't have that striking appearance as the other two, do. As it's a pink wine. Clearly.
Yeah. And I think that's the 18 you're on too, there, David, isn't it? So 18 was tricky. It was our previously largest harvest, but it was a big harvest. So again, color, and I think that one particularly, we did struggle with color on that one and getting it right.
Well, for those here in the United States listening to this, it's no slam. The wine's delicious. Please pick it up. It's in the market right now. The 2019 is not quite yet available here in the U.S. And though Chris says it will appear to be more pink, it's probably no less a wine in taste as well. I'm enjoying it here, and I enjoyed it a little bit last night, to be fair. Yeah, I opened these all wines last night to make sure everything was correct, and they certainly were. Thank you all again. That said, Scott's wines that you sent me, its palate richness that you were talking about. How long has this been on the lees?
So 4 years,
right
around 48 months, and that's kind of like our base process. Press to 120, 4 years on lees, and then I'm transitioning a little bit right now As we went estate in 2015, I lowered dosage as had more control over pick points, and lowering the dosage has allowed me to release it sooner after dosage, as opposed to when we were in our infancy, we were probably rocking right around 12 grams a liter, and it would take 9, 12 months for the wine to really integrate with the dosage. And now I'm at 6 to 4, depending on vintage. No, when you have full control over your vineyard, you have no one to blame if you bring it in at 7. So you get to avoid that extra malic, and we don't do any mallow also. So I wear the acid fully, and it kind of takes 4 years to get to that point where I think everything's in balance from an autolysis standpoint and a fruit and an acid, and still has a long life ahead of it, where the 18 is now going to be 58 months on tirage, and that's going to be released here in the next couple months, but just took less time on cork, more time on lees prior to release. And it just gave the progression of the program.
Thanks. And according to the tasting notes that was sent by your importer Winebow here, Louisa, your premium rosé labeled as non-vintage is a far more wide-ranging and complex sourcing that I believe that Haddingly and Caraccioli have. It seems from what's being described here, you have vineyards in 3 different parts of Tasmania as well. You're subjecting it to both stainless steel and hogshead aging, and it is combination of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, from what it seems. So you have a broader palette that you're working with here.
Yeah, so for our non-vintage, absolutely. Our vintage wine is single vineyard, but we do have vineyards. So at the original Jantz vineyard, which is where the vintage wine comes from, is at Pipers River, which is in the north of Tasmanian Island. Beautiful climate. Literally, you stand in the Pinot Noir and you look out over Bass Strait, which is that wild piece of sea that's between the Tasmania and the mainland of Australia. And so that's quite maritime influence in its characters, in that sort of really cool climate. And then we have some growers that grow grapes for us on the Tamar Valley, which is sort of not about an hour away from there, but still influenced by water, but the Tamar River as opposed to being ocean. And then we have our much drier vineyards down out near Hobart, so in the southeast of Tasmania, and it's a very dry climate, very different. Even though you might have the same sort of analyses on the wines, when you analyse them, they are quite different in the way that they feel in your mouth. The acidity that you get in that dry climate is sort of laser-like and pristine, whereas in the north around Pipers River, you're getting more creaminess and textures from it. It's quite fascinating, and that's one of the beauties of both of the ability to blend, and sparkling wines often are so much about blending, whether you're blending varieties, whether you're blending regions, whether you're blending vintages, as we also do in this case. It does have some Chardonnay in it. I'm not exactly sure which bottling you have there, but it's usually around 20%. So it is typically very much Pinot Noir dominant. And I think particularly with that non-vintage, you're starting to see some really beautiful sort of perfumes and rose petals and strawberries and those sort of fruit, as well as some of that nougat coming in from that bottle age.
And just to add on that, our wine also, David, it's a multi-regional, inverted commas, in that we don't have designated GIs yet in the UK, but we'll source from east, or it's all pretty much south of London, but yeah, from Suffolk, Essex, Kent, Hampshire. We source across multiple regions, and really that's a risk mitigation strategy, with the byproduct of there being nuance from the different parcels that we have come in. And like Lou says, the beauty of our sparkling wines is really what happens on the blending table, and being able to bring in all those different elements that we want in the final blend. And whilst we will make a vintage wine and we want to celebrate the uniqueness of the vintage, there is a sort of a house style or a consistency we are looking to achieve. And that's through blending across those regions. It's too early for us to say that sort of Kent has XYZ flavor profile versus Hampshire, which is this. It's too variable and it's too early yet. And a lot of our wines are very young, but by having a broad palette in terms of color, the painting palette allows us to work towards a more consistent style, even though it's a vintage wine. But really our multi-sourcing or multi-regional sourcing is based on risk mitigation with the upshot that it does have, you do have different flavor profiles and different elements that you can blend into a finished wine, I think.
Running the danger here of coming across as a bit pedantic, this is something for the general public, so it bears asking. You all are working, as you said, with various Pinot varieties and with Chardonnay exclusively for your sparkling wine. So why is it that these varieties, excuse me, having been founded upon the aspirational wines of Champagne, why is it that other red grapes aren't used more frequently for making pink sparkling wines? What is there in particular about the Pinots, let's kind of laser down, that make them more attractive, more of a goal for quality sparkling wines, especially when we're talking about pink colored ones?
I've got a really easy answer. Oh, sorry. You go, Luke. No, you go, Luke. I was just going to say, I've got a really easy answer. We've struggled to ripen the red varieties. I mean, we've got some of these hybrids and things that we can do, but they're not premium quality. So for us in England, it's really driven just by what we can ripen. It's no more complex than that, really.
Well, let's kick it back to Louisa and to Scott.
Yeah, look, I've made over the years, and not necessarily, some might say, but sparkling wines and from other red varieties, rosés from Cabernet and Shiraz,
Grenache,
and they all have their own sort of unique characters. But I think what Pinot Noir particularly brings, and Chardonnay as well, is not a dominant fruit flavour. I mean, with sparkling wines, when you have that carbon dioxide in there from the fermentation, it lifts and it enhances often particular aromas and characteristics. And if they're not complex and subtle amongst themselves, then they can really stick out, and not necessarily in a good way. So I would say that the beauty of particularly a Pinot Noir is that it has the complexity and the completeness without aggressive aromas that will be enhanced with the bubbles as those bubbles sort of come out. So they're the varieties that work historically. Now, there's plenty of others for a bit of fun that you can make into rosés, but when it comes to classics, when it comes to wines that are lovely young and then with age and that are aging with those right characteristics as well, then I don't think you can go past Pinot Noir.
Yeah, I tend to agree, Louisa. It's one of those things where, to me, there's an elegance that you can achieve with these varietals where other things can work, but maybe the wines get a little bit more clunky. They're not as speaking to what I think you're trying to achieve in making premium sparkling wine. And it's in small doses, it makes sense. And there's things that are in the same pocket of wine that always interested me. I've tasted some great cuvées made from some other varietals outside of like the Champagne 3 that kind of predominantly everybody thinks about. And I've loved them, but it's to me, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, the greatest sparkling wines I've had were dominated by those two varietals, one way or another.
Wondering, it was touched upon briefly early in the conversation, to what degree do you reckon that the rise of pink wines in general, still wines in particular, here in the US market and other markets as well? I understand some European markets have enjoyed this in recent years. The uptick in pink wine consumption has affected or reflected upon those sparkling versions or not?
I would say it's on trend, that there's definitely, with the rise in still rosé, there were people that wanted to drink sparkling rosé also. I've actually had a guy in LA who was pouring both magnums of brut rosé and magnums of Cariccioli still rosé, and he was coming to tables and saying still or sparkling. So it was definitely, and this is probably 2017, 2018, but I think that there was definitely a uptick where there was no rosé on the market. Then a few people had rosé, and then everybody has rosé. And at the same vein, that's happening in sparkling wine as well, where a lot of the wineries that are maybe still wine dominant have never made a sparkling wine now would like to make a couple hundred cases of this or a couple hundred cases of that to kind of fill their portfolio, or even more focused sparkling programs where when we started in '06, there were very few people in America really making, in California, making sparkling wine that were focused on making sparkling wine. There was the houses that were supported by French houses, and then there was a smattering of other brands, but not, it was never really a focus of an area or a focus of like a movement in time, other than when really a lot of the French houses came to America. Since then, probably in the last 8 to 10 years, maybe even more so, like right before COVID, like 19, 18, it was very trending, popular, I would say, like sparkling wine in general and rosé at the same
I
time.
think one of the things about, and we've absolutely seen the still rosés become more popular and the sparklings over the last decade or so, couple of decades. One of the problems with sparkling rosés is if they're not, if they don't sell within your sort of ideal window, because their color is so beautiful and so pale, you lose that lovely, depending on what color you're actually looking for in your wines, but you lose that really pretty pink color. And what we saw in Australia when sparkling rosés weren't popular was that they would sit around on the shelves, and then while they would still taste delicious and they would still be perfect in every way, when you poured them into the glass, they had more of that sort of coppery or sort of amber sort of hue rather than the pink. And
Onion.
people go, oh, that's not what I was expecting. So you have to have that sort of critical mass, I think, and that pull through to make sure that your wines are behaving the way they should when they're being opened. I think that was an issue, particularly in the Australian market as rosé started to become popular. Interestingly, you talk about COVID, Scott. Sparkling wines for us in Australia, we thought sparkling wines would just die as a category. What were people going to celebrate? In actual fact, they were the category that really grew during COVID, which I thought was just fantastic. And that really means that people are really embracing them as part of their lifestyle more than just for a celebration.
Agreed. Saw the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, during pandemic, I got a crazy bee in my bonnet, and I put the word out to a bunch of sparkling wine producers of note in non-left coast states. Sorry, Scott, saying, send me a bottle of this. I want to write a quick something so people can get through the hard times. And I received fantastic bottles from Michigan, Colorado, and other off-piste states in the U.S. that I had great pleasure enjoying and writing about when there was nothing to do and no one was hearing from you. Good thing to say. Louisa, I just popped the cork on your 2019 vintage, 30 months on the lees, and then some, 100% Pinot Noir from the Jantz Vineyard. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, so that's that beautiful vineyard that was originally planted in 1986, and it was originally a joint venture between Louis Roederer and a small Tasmanian winery called Heemskirk. When they established it, I believe Roederer were looking around the world for another great sparkling wine region, and they thought they found it in northern Tasmania. We would absolutely agree. And it's one of the most beautiful sort of vineyards. All vineyards are beautiful, I know, but you just look out over the ocean. And yeah, 100% Pinot Noir. And when you taste those grapes in the vineyard, you know when they're ready to pick because they taste just like that wine that you're tasting there, David. It's the rose petals, the strawberries. In fact, we often have a bowl of strawberries up there while we're picking the grapes because it's not that they're not going into the wine, I might say. And then with that time, so it does spend. So it's all just fermented as a base wine in very mature French oak barrels. So we're not looking for oak flavors, but we're just looking for that beautiful way of aging where the wine slowly breathes with the air through the oak. It sits on its lees. It's full malo, so the opposite to you, Scott. We use full malolactic fermentation because we need that to deacidify. We have high acids, maybe not quite as high as Chris's, but still up often around that sort of 10 grams, which is high. And the malolactic for us gives us an extra creaminess to the wine. And then at 30 months in the bottle, after this bottle fermentation, that's where you start to really pull out some of those sort of truffles and slight sort of honeycomb characters that they go with that umami that we were talking about before. And it's just a lot of fun. We do use Pinot Noir wine at dosage just to bring out that pink, which is different to what Scott was talking about before. We bring that final colour top up when we liqueur it, and it's usually around 4.5. I think you've got the 19, haven't you, David?
I do.
Pretty sure that, yeah, that was about that sort of at that 4.5 dosage, which is drier than it was. I think these wines have been drying off over the years. It seems to me people are looking for complexity, not just for the sort of the sweetness, which is, I think, a trend.
The wine's still very on the young side, I would say. Your comment about the truffles, I think they're not quite there yet, but I could see them developing in some months, if not a couple of years' time. The wine certainly has the stuffing to see it through and then some. It's funny you should mention the connection to Rotor, because Chris was previously employed by the same company that Louisa continues with, Hill Smith Family Estates, working with them as well. As how they know each other. For some of you may have picked up his referring to as Lou. And the fact that, Lisa, you just mentioned the connection with Rotor kind of brings it full circle, in as much as Scott's. I already mentioned Michelle Saguas, who comes from the Rotor family, having established Rotor Estate in Mendocino County, Anderson Valley, California, and then joining to help build up his family estate as well. So I had no expectation of this. There are intersectionality between all three of you. Nice to see that happening.
It's a small world, the wine industry, David. You know that.
Very small.
Lastly, the timeliness of the podcast, I opened up saying here that with Valentine's Day upon us and everything looking pink, beyond this, how and why should these sparkling wines, these rosé pink sparkling wines, be considered throughout the year, not just at this timely time?
Mm-hmm. I'll talk a little bit. I mean, this is probably more to do with the Hattingly brand in general, is that what we're trying to do with the brand, and we're young and we're growing and we're sort of learning on the way, but we don't want kind of curated consumption moments. We want these, I call them agnostic consumption moments. So you're not having to, it doesn't need to be a special occasion. We'll commercialize Valentine's Day as much as we need to sell some more wine, but we want people to be enjoying our wines, whether it's a rosé or anything. But, living on topic, but rosé, it's versatile. It's like we said before, it doesn't just need to be as an aperitif or at the start or a amuse-bouche. There's a seriousness there. And I think we want inclusive consumption moments, not these exclusive consumption moments. So it's about being able to enjoy the wine with brunch, with lunch, with whenever, really. I mean, I think that there's enough complexity and richness in the wine. And I think this is a general thing for sparkling wines. I think for too long we've thought about them as being kind of, you start the meal or you start the evening with them and then you forget about them and you move on to still wines. But I think the evolution of styles and using oak, using extended lees aging, all of these sort of things, they can really add. They can be as interesting in with food or across. There is a versatility to them that I don't think's really been interrogated, and that's definitely what we're trying to do with the Hattingly brand. I'm not sure what the other guys are doing, but we don't. I mean, our business is sparkling wines. I've got nothing else really to sell. Tiny bit of still wine, but I need people to be drinking sparkling wine as often as they can and as frequently as they can. So just to have that as a celebratory wine, I think gives us a limited life cycle as a business. So we need them to be exploring across lots of different consumption moments.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's one of those things where I think the market has a certain percentage of the market has thoughts on how and when they consume sparkling wine. And it's our job to kind of change that perception and push it to all of the time. Whenever you're thinking about grabbing a bottle of wine, you should be considering a bottle of sparkling wine. And I do think that there's more and more momentum of that in the States now than there probably has been, in my opinion. I can look at production and you can kind of see it coming down the line of it's being pulled. And at the same time, it's one of those things from my perspective at Caraccioli, it's what we identify with as being a brand, is making vintage to vintage, high quality sparkling wine out of Monterey County, Santa Lucia Islands. And you kind of live or die by the sword. And you want it to be one of those things where you get everybody on board. And then I do believe that when you get people on board, they become far more into what modern day sparkling wine is in a lot of ways, where it was a lot of ways more specified to champagne in people's minds, regardless if that was the case or not, where I think people are more open now in America, my markets that I see most often, to drinking sparkling wine and to that being the first thing and going to a bottle and not just a glass. And maybe that sits on the table and continues on.
I would agree absolutely with what Scott and Chris have both said. So I won't add to that. And we talked a bit about food before as well. But I think one of the things that the beauty of sparkling wines are not just their complexity, but also the fact that they're typically not high alcohol wines. And that's something that we talk about a lot. I think you can get the complexity and the richness and probably a percent or two less of alcohol than you might with a red wine. There's a beautiful sort of bonus with that. And the other thing that I think is important is that I can't think of the last time I poured a sparkling wine into a flute. I know they might look beautiful, but it's not the best way to taste wine. And Chris mentioned it before, with great sparkling wine, you're going to get the best out of it by putting it into a beautiful wine glass. And wine glasses are very personal sort of things. I know we could probably talk for an hour about those as well, but anything other than a flute, I would say, will bring out the best of any sparkling wine.
I have to say that there's been a bit of a trend here in the States and a little bit in the UK, as far as I know, towards the Petit Naturel, Pet Nat wines. And in doing so, it's helped open up the younger demographic to sparkling wines that are admittedly more affordable and more fun and natural, for lack of a better term. And those wines are often served from Arco Rock tumbler glasses. And that's helping to demystify what you were alluding to, Louisa, about these wines being served in flutes. It's not necessary. As a matter of fact, they're a bit delicate as a former sommelier to work with. I've only broken one tray of those glasses. In that case, making these wines more accessible to the general public and taking the previous associations out of them is only going to help these quality wines as people move from these Pet Nat Albariños or Trebbianos into the more classic styles. When they have the interest and the pocketbook to afford them, allows this to occur. I want to encourage every listener to this podcast to make their way. Admittedly, almost everybody's here in the United States. Getting to the Santa Lucia Highlands of Monterey, California is easy enough. Go visit Caraccioli. They've got plenty of opportunities for you to enjoy their wines and vineyards there. If you make it over to England, do make it over to Haddingly. It's not all that far from London. I strongly recommend doing so. I lived there for a long time, and I was writing about English sparkling wines even before Haddingly started up, writing nice things about the very erratic wines back then that were existing. And I once had the great pleasure of visiting Tasmania, one of my 2 visits to Australia, having met Louisa there briefly when she was giving a presentation to a group of journalists, of which I was one. And I had an immensely enjoyable time during my couple of weeks in Tassie. I want to thank you all for Jansz. That's spelled Jansz. For those wondering, Haddingly, that's with an E between the L and the Y at the end. And Caraccioli, it's right there. Lots of C's in the name. Please do enjoy these pink rosé sparkling wines of quality during the pending Valentine's Day time and beyond. Thank you for joining Drinking on the Edge.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you all. Cheers.